It was just another Friday night at the bar, a cozy, dimly lit place that felt like a second home to Sarah. She had been coming here for months, sitting at the same spot by the window, nursing a drink, and unwinding after a long work week. The bar was always quiet on Friday evenings, the perfect place to escape the chaos of her day-to-day life. But on this particular night, something was off. As she settled in, she noticed him for the first time. A man sitting in the corner booth. He was older than the usual crowd, dressed in a worn-out jacket, his face shadowed by the low light. But what caught her attention wasn't his appearance. It was the way he was staring at her. Not just a passing glance, but a fixed, intense stare that never seemed to break. Sarah tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the guy just being another lonely drinker. She ordered another drink, hoping to shake off the feeling creeping up her spine. But as the night wore on, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze on her. Every time she looked up, his eyes were on her. No one else seemed to notice, but Sarah felt like she was the only person in the room. She made her way to the restroom, hoping a quick break would calm her nerves. But as she washed her hands, she noticed something strange, a reflection in the mirror. The man from the corner booth was standing just behind her, watching her with that same eerie stare. Her heart skipped a beat, and when she turned to confront him, he was gone. It felt like an illusion, like he hadn't been there at all, but the feeling of his presence lingered. When she returned to her seat, he was still there, staring at her with that unblinking gaze. The bartender, a familiar face named Jake, noticed her unease. "You okay?" he asked, leaning over the counter with a concerned look. Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but something about this man felt off. "That guy, the one in the corner, he's been staring at me all night. Do you know him?" Jake's face went pale. He glanced over at the man, then back at Sarah, his voice low. "Yeah, I know him. His name's Charlie. He's been coming in here for years, but he doesn't talk much to anyone." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew something wasn't right. Does he always stare like that? Jake shifted uncomfortably. He's never hurt anyone, but some of the regulars here, they say he's been following women around for years. No one's ever reported him doing anything, but it's creepy. He's obsessed with watching people, especially women. Just then, Charlie stood up and left, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were still on her, even as he disappeared into the night. The next Friday, Sarah returned, but this time, Charlie was already there. He was sitting in his usual corner, staring at her from the moment she walked in. Her anxiety spiked, and as the night wore on, she felt his eyes never leave her. After her third drink, she made the decision to leave early. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door, but as she stepped outside, she froze. There, standing in the shadows by her car, was Charlie. She tried to shake it off, telling herself he was just another man out for a smoke, but his eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, were locked onto her. Sarah quickly walked to her car, fumbling for her keys. She could hear his footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. Panic surged through her, and she nearly jumped into the car, locking the door before she even sat down. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching her. He didn't move, just stood in the shadows, his figure silhouetted against the dim streetlights. The next week, Sarah didn't come back to the bar. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, but when she eventually returned, she asked Jake about Charlie. He told her something that made her blood run cold. That guy, Charlie, he's been doing this for years. The thing is, he doesn't talk to anyone, not a word, he just watches. Every woman he's fixated on. They say he follows them home. No one's ever been hurt, but I've seen him parked outside some of the regulars' houses, always at night, and he's never said a word to any of them. Sarah's stomach churned as she listened. "But the worst part?" Jake whispered. "The cops know about him. But they've never been able to do anything. There's just something unsettling about him. Some people say he's harmless. Others think he's just waiting for the right moment." Then, one night, it happened. Charlie followed Sarah home. She saw him from her bedroom window, standing outside, watching her house. But when she called the cops, they couldn't find him. He was gone, like he'd vanished into thin air. The last time Sarah came into the bar, it was months later. She asked Jake if Charlie had ever returned. Jake's face turned grim. "He hasn't been back, but I've heard he's still around, somewhere, and he's still watching." I work at an owner bar in the city that I live in, the somewhat small town, but has a cool little downtown area. My bar, a modest establishment with just enough character to stand out, has been my passion project for 4 years now. While business is steady today, things weren't always like this. Back in the first year, the place was still trying to make a name for itself, and there were nights so quiet that I could hear the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. One of those quiet nights, early in my journey as a bar owner, stands out. Not because of the calm, but because of what happened when the calm was shattered. It was a Tuesday, typically a slow night, and I had been the only one working. We didn't serve food back then, just drinks, so weeknights often meant sparse crowds, or sometimes no crowd at all. That evening had been uneventful. A few regulars had popped in for a quick drink before heading home, but by 10 p.m. the place was empty. The clock ticked steadily, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards keeping me company. Around 11 p.m., just an hour before closing, I heard the chime of the door. I looked up from wiping down the bar to see a man walking in. My bar isn't large. A dozen bar stools, a pool table, a dartboard, and a handful of high tables. From where I stood, I could see the man clearly as he entered. He wasn't tall, maybe 5'6", and he wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He moved quickly, almost purposefully, to one of the high tables in the far corner and sat down, facing the wall. "Hey there," I greeted him, trying to sound friendly. He didn't respond. I paused for a moment, watching him. He sat stiffly, his back to me, and didn't appear to be looking at a menu or even glancing around. He didn't have a phone out or anything, just sat there, still, like a statue. Something about his presence sent a faint chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. People came into bars for all sorts of reasons, and maybe he just needed a moment to himself. I busied myself behind the bar, trying not to stare. Minutes ticked by and he didn't move. Occasionally, I'd glance over, hoping he might wave me down for a drink or at least acknowledge my presence, but he remained fixed in his seat, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. At around 11:30, I decided to give him a heads up about closing time. "Just so you know, we'll be closing up in about 30 minutes, I called out. He didn't react. No nod, no glance, nothing. I felt my frustration rising. I wasn't sure what his deal was, but his complete disregard for basic interaction was unnerving. Still, I decided not to push him. Needing a break from the tension, I stepped into the small back room we used for storage. It wasn't much, just a cramped space with shelves of liquor bottles, cleaning supplies, and an old mini-fridge. I grabbed a fresh bottle of tonic water and headed back out, only to freeze in my tracks. The man was gone. Relief washed over me. Maybe he'd just needed a quiet place to sit for a while, and now he'd left. I walked over to the table where he'd been sitting, expecting to find it empty, but it was spotless. No empty glass, no sign he'd even been there. Shaking my head, I returned to the bar to finish up my closing routine. It was a little early, but I decided to lock the front door. As I walked over, the quiet of the bar felt heavier, almost oppressive. I turned the deadbolt, tested the handle to make sure it was secure, and then began heading back toward the bar. That's when I saw him again. He was crouched behind the pool table, half hidden in the shadows. My heart jumped into my throat. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, it was him. The hat, the stiff posture, it was unmistakable. And then, before I could process what was happening, he lunged at me. He moved fast, too fast. Adrenaline surged through me as I instinctively darted to the right, putting the bar between us. I vaulted over it, knocking over a stool in the process. The man skidded to a stop on the other side, his eyes wide and wild. For the first time, I got a good look at his face. It was pale, almost sickly, with the deep-set eyes that burned with something I can only describe as madness. He started toward me again, but this time he hesitated when he reached the bar. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I sprinted to the back room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the latch on the back door as I heard him pounding on the other side of the storage room door. Finally, I threw it open and ran outside into the alley behind the bar. The night air was cold and sharp, but I barely noticed. My mind raced as I pulled out my phone and called the police. I kept glancing at the back door, half expecting him to burst through at any moment. The alley was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp near the parking lot. I paced nervously, clutching my phone like a lifeline. After what felt like an eternity, the door flew open, and the man came barreling out. For a terrifying moment, our eyes met, and I thought he was going to come after me again. But instead, he turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, disappearing into the shadows of the alleyway. When the police arrived a few minutes later, I was still shaking. I led them inside to show them the damage. The bar was a mess. Broken bottles littered the floor, chairs were overturned, and the cash register had been yanked open, though nothing seemed to be missing. The officers took my statement and assured me they'd patrol the area, but they never caught the guy. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I walked into the bar, I half expected to see him sitting in that corner table again. I installed security cameras and started keeping a baseball bat behind the bar, just in case. And though I've had my fair share of strange encounters as a bar owner since then, none have left me quite as shaken as that night. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself glancing at that corner table, wondering if I'll ever see him again. Something really strange happened last year, and I still can't wrap my head around it. It was a weekend night, and I went out with some friends. We started at a restaurant in the city, then moved to a couple of bars. Being the weekend, everywhere we went was packed with people. We got to the last bar of the night around 11 p.m. The place was busy, but we were having a good time, hanging out near the bar and enjoying ourselves. After about an hour, something unexpected happened. I was standing near my friends, just minding my own business when this man came up to me out of nowhere. He looked angry, like he had some kind of issue with me, but I didn't recognize him at all. He walked right up to me and said, "I need to talk to you." Confused, I asked what was going on, but instead of explaining, he shoved me. It wasn't a light push either. It felt deliberate. I was stunned, trying to figure out what his problem was. This wasn't just some random drunk guy causing trouble. He seemed to genuinely think I had done something to him. I asked, "What's your problem?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he started cursing at me and took a step closer, clearly ready to escalate things. At that point, I was ready to stand my ground and confront him. I stepped toward him, but my friends quickly intervened. They pulled me back and got in between us before things could get physical. The man backed off, muttering angrily as he walked away to another part of the bar. My friends turned to me and asked, "What was that about?" I told them the truth. I had no idea who he was or why he was so mad at me. It didn't make any sense. He had said he needed to talk to me, but all he seemed to want was to start a fight. For the rest of the night I kept an eye out for him, but he seemed to have disappeared. I figured he had left the bar, so I shrugged it off and went back to hanging out with my friends. Another hour passed, and we decided to call it a night. As we left the bar, our group split up. 3 of my friends took an Uber together. Another walked back to his apartment downtown, and I planned to grab my own ride home since I lived in the opposite direction. After my friends got in their Uber and left, I was standing alone on the sidewalk, waiting for my ride. That's when I saw him again, the same guy who had shoved me earlier. He was standing about 50 feet away to my left, just watching me. I don't know if he had been there the whole time and I hadn't noticed, or if he'd just shown up, but as soon as I spotted him, he started walking toward me. I immediately felt uneasy. I didn't want another confrontation, so I turned and started walking away. I thought maybe he'd lose interest, but when I glanced back, I saw he was following me and walking fast. That's when I decided to run. I sprinted down the sidewalk as fast as I could, and sure enough, he started running after me. Thankfully, I was much faster than him. I kept running, putting as much distance between us as possible until I couldn't see him anymore. I stopped a few blocks away, panting and trying to catch my breath. I had to cancel the Uber I'd originally ordered since I was no longer anywhere near the pickup spot. I called for another ride and waited, constantly looking around to make sure he hadn't found me again. Then I finally stopped, caught my breath, and called another ride home. I wouldn't be able to take the other Uber that I had ordered previously. I was left extremely confused about the whole thing, and I'm still confused. I think that maybe the guy got me confused with somebody else, and he must have been really mad at this person, whoever he thought I was, because I can't really think of any reason why he would be angry at me.